We're at the end, the last day of our Happy Birthday Seventh-day Adventist Church series, celebrating the 150th birthday of our church. Our balloons are tired, they're done, and we're finishing the series as well. Today we finish with the last of our 4 questions. When did we learn about diversity? Diverse chocolate chip cookies? Diverse Seventh-day Adventist Church? Diversity. Now, folks, did you know that there is a thing called the Word of the Year? Did you know that? I didn't either until this week. The Oxford English Dictionary picks the word of the year every year. They put in a whole bunch of new words in the dictionary, and they pick one that is the word of the year. This is the word of the year, selfie. Now, when I thought about this past year, I thought maybe selfish should be the word of the year. But maybe it's the word of every year because we human beings are too often selfish. Do y'all know what a selfie is? A selfie is a photograph, generally that you take of yourself, generally taken with either a smartphone or a webcam, and then it's posted on some social media website. Something like this. That's actually called a funeral selfie. It's one of the new things. You take a picture of yourself at a funeral and put it on Facebook. There's all kinds of selfies. Do you know what a healthy is? A healthy is a picture of your hand that you've taken yourself and posted on a social media website. Generally speaking, a healthy will have a brand new diamond engagement ring on the hand, yes. There's also a belfie. That's your backside. There's a shelfie. That's a picture of a shelf. And all kinds of selfies. I actually wonder about this one. See, I found that picture on the internet. Now, I have to be really honest with you. I don't take pictures of myself at arm's length like this very often. But if I looked like that, I don't think I'd put it anywhere for anybody else to see. Selfies. Even here in the Beltsville Church, we get selfies. Our adventurer leader and his family posted a selfie of their outing to the Great Falls area a few months back. Selfies. Now here's a question I want to ask you. We want to think about diversity today. How many of you have thought about taking a picture of yourself in church, posting it on Facebook as we speak in the next couple of minutes, and saying, I wish you were at church with me today? See, we have a lot of diversity in the way we share Jesus with other people. Some people go door to door and hand out literature. Some people go to the grocery store and smile. Some people go to the drive-thru and pay for the person behind them. The WGTS 91.9 drive-thru difference. It's diversity, and diversity comes in a million different ways and styles. But we still are focusing on this question. When did we learn about diversity? Now, if you look at the front of your bulletin, you'll see that we've been asking several questions. We've been celebrating our 150th birthday by looking at different questions about the Adventist Church. When did we learn that Jesus is coming again soon? That was our first question. And the answer we came up with was in the 1830s, maybe early 1840s. It's when William Miller not only had his calculations right, but learned that it was Jesus who was coming and that he wanted to see him again. And that was when we learn that Jesus is coming again soon. And then we asked, when did we learn that the seventh day was the Sabbath? And our answer there was in the 1840s, and you'll remember specifically we looked at the 1848 Sabbath conferences. And the believers, there wasn't an Adventist church at that point, the Millerite believers who'd been through the disappointment of Jesus not coming back when they thought he would in 1844, the Millerite believers got together, studied this, and realized it was what God wanted. It was what they were going to do. The seventh day became the Sabbath of that group of believers. Our third question was, when did we learn that people are saved by grace? And we even kind of went down to almost a 2-week period. In 1888, there was a general conference session where all the leaders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church at that time got together, and they studied the Bible again, and they found that there was grace, and that is what makes people Christians and makes them saved. Now, I put the date 1888 up there, but you need to understand that it took several years before this filtered out, before it became part of what we truly believed as individuals. But now we come to our fourth question. When did we learn about diversity? Now, to help us get a little better picture of that, let's take a look at Adventist growth around the world. Let's look first at membership. In 1890, there were about 30,000 Seventh-day Adventists. Now, virtually all of them lived in America. A few lived in Western Europe or in Australia, but it was like 90% lived in America. 30,000 people. That's quite a growth from when the church started in 1863, where there were just over 3,000 believers. That's a very heavy growth. But look what happened. By 1950, there were 800,000 members. The majority of them did not live in the United States. In fact, about 2/3 of them lived outside the United States. We had come in contact with a lot more different cultures, different ways of viewing Jesus, different ways of expressing faith, different ways of sharing faith. And then, 50 years later, in 2000, there were 12 million members. Here's a graph. Do you see how that graph of membership is almost like it's spiking straight upwards? When there were 12 million members, we had about 4 million members in Africa, about 1 million members in America. We had about 4 million members in Central and South America, 2 million members in the Far East, and those numbers have grown quite a bit. We now have a majority of people in this church living south of the equator, and it changes who we are as a people. Let's take a look at it from another point, the countries with organized Adventist work. Now, as I was reading this week and studying, in 1890, the church information says there were 8 countries where we had Seventh-day Adventist church work. In 1950, that number was more than 130. And in 2000, that number was 207. Now, that doesn't seem like it's growing quite as fast. That's because there's only so many countries. And now that number is closer to 220 countries where Adventists have a church work, and there's only 230 or 35 countries in the world. See, there was this incredible growth because Adventists took very seriously what Jesus said that's recorded in Matthew 24, and he says, "This gospel shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all people." Adventists said we want to do that. Adventists got a little different picture as well of the first angel's message. Oh, that had been part of what was preached in the 1830s and 40s with the Millerite message. But we looked at it and said, wow, there's an angel flying with an everlasting gospel there in Revelation 14. That first angel's message says the gospel is going to every nation and tribe and tongue and people. And we went to work at that as a church. And we had people from every part of the world. Did you know that in this round globe, where it's right now almost 1 o'clock here, and I'm going to have to preach a little longer so those cookies get baked, you know. That's the only reason I'm preaching longer, you know. This world, this round globe, there's an Adventist church in every time zone. So from Friday night on sundown out in the Pacific Ocean until Saturday night at sundown out in the Pacific Ocean, 47 hours later, that's what it means to be in a round globe. There are Seventh-day Adventists keeping the Sabbath, connecting with God on the Sabbath worship day around the world. We are everywhere. So when did we learn about diversity? Well, I'm putting up a date there. Y'all know why I might pick 1944? We need some history buffs. In 1944, the Seventh-day Adventist Church made a change in its organizational structure and created what we called regional conferences. Now, a conference is a grouping of churches. The Beltsville Church is part of the Potomac Conference. There's 160 churches that are part of the Potomac Conference. And incidentally, the Potomac Conference is part of the Columbia Union. It's one of 8 conferences and more than 600 churches in the Columbia Union. Up until this point in 1944, there had never been a conference made up entirely of historically black churches, churches that had black membership predominantly, almost exclusively. And the black leadership in the church had been saying, we need these conferences. Keep in mind, in 1944, we're a long ways back in relationships between races. And so in 1944, we had the chance to say, let's make regional conferences so that there could be opportunities for black leadership to develop skills and to develop the work as well. We lived in a largely segregated society here in America. Let's build ourselves that structure. Now, there are people today who say to me, why do we have regional conferences? It's so archaic. There are 9 of them in North America now. We shouldn't have that. How can we talk about diversity and equality if we have black conferences? Well, I respond to those folks that in 1944, this was a different country. In 1944, at an Adventist college, and I won't give you the name of it, when they held chapel, the blacks sat in the back rows. In 1944, a woman came to a Seventh-day Adventist hospital, and she was an African American with very light skin. They admitted her to the emergency room, but when they found her heritage and learned that she was African American, they pushed her out. She had pneumonia. By the time a hospital that would accept her came to get her and brought her to the hospital, the pneumonia had advanced to the place where she died. There was an important reason why we needed to give opportunities for black churches and black leaders to grow. And it's worked well. Now, it may be that we don't need regional conferences anymore, but it took 20 or 30 years for us to make a decision to start them. It may take more than 20 or 30 years for us to come to a full realization that they should be changed again. Well, when did we learn about diversity? 1944 is an interesting point. 1962 is an interesting point as well. I had thought this happened in 1958. but everything I read said 1962. The first person of color was elected a vice president of the World Church, of the Seventh-day Adventist World Headquarters Office, the General Conference. His name was Frank Peterson. I remember him because he came to Minnesota camp meeting. And you know, Minnesota has got a few Scandinavians. And I was a kid growing up there, and when Frank Peterson came to the Minnesota conference, he said, "It's so good to be here with my cousins." Everybody smiled and joked, and I thought, wow, he wouldn't have had to make that joke. That was nice. It may be that we learned about diversity in 1986. I picked this date because in 1986, I was asked to be the communication director of the Columbia Union. That's that grouping of 8 conferences and 600 plus churches. One of those conferences is the Allegheny East Conference. It's a regional conference made up of historically black churches. And my first assignment was to go to camp meeting at the Allegheny East Conference camp meeting grounds. It's fabulous. There's, 5, 6, 8,000 people who show up on Saturday morning for worship there. And I showed up as one of the 4 white people on the grounds. You're going to get noticed. But that was okay. I'm there representing the Columbia Union. I'm kind of glad that they would notice me. However, I also realized there's a pavilion that produces shade. It makes shade for people to sit inside of. About 1,000, maybe 1,500 people can sit in the pavilion. There's 5,000 or 6,000 people there. A whole lot more people are sitting outside the pavilion in the sunshine. On my fair skin, I'm going to change color before the service is over. So I decide I'm going to be selfish. I'm going to go inside and I'm going to find a place to sit down. There's just one. I'm just one person. There's got to be one empty seat in there. So I walk in the back doors and I walk up the aisle. Looks pretty full. Looks pretty full. I saw an empty seat. Oh, you're saving it. Okay. I'm at row 4 before I find an empty seat. There's 2 empty seats. I say, could I sit there? And they say, well, one person said, I'm saving 1 seat. But the other seat was available. I came in and sat down. The woman beside me looked at me and said, who are you? I said, well, I'm the new communication director for the Columbia Union Conference. My name's Kermit Netterberg. Do you get the Columbia Union Visitor, the magazine we send out? Oh, I do. Well, I'm the new editor of that. Oh, wow. Let me tell you about my church. And she's from the Trinity Temple Church in New Jersey, Newark. And she says to me all the wonderful things about her church. She's just so happy. She loves her church. And we talked for 4 or 5 minutes. And she's still talking with me when the folks come on the platform to make some announcements and ask if everybody should quiet down. And I say, oh, we better quiet down. And so she says, okay, just a minute though. And she opens her purse. And inside the purse is a bag of hard candies. True story, I'm not making a word of this up. She scoops into that bag of candies and drops, there must have been 5, 6, 8 hard candies in my hand and says, sometimes these services can run a little long. They get done with the announcements. The true story, they get done with the announcements. The woman whose this seat was saved for comes in and sits down. Oh, who are you? I'm Kermit Netterberg. I'm the editor of the Visitor. Oh, I love that paper. Tell me about your church. I'm from the Calvary Temple Church in Newark News. And she tells me about her wonderful church. And then the ministers come onto the platform and they're kneeling down for the divine service to begin and we need to be quiet. So I say, oh, we better be quiet. And she says, just a minute. She opens her purse. True story. I'm not making a word of this up, I swear. There's a bag of hard candies in there. She reaches in. She grabs a whole bunch of candies. She grabs my hand. She puts them in. She says to the word, sometimes these services run a little long. Do you know how sometimes people say something to you and you hear a message behind what they're saying? I heard two things that day. I heard, this poor little white boy don't have any idea what he's getting into. But I also heard two people who wanted me to enjoy worship, to connect with God, and to love Jesus more when the worship service was over. And when we look at this question, I'll make it a little more personal. One of the great times I learned about diversity was at Allegheny East Camp meeting that day, where two women explained to me that in our culture, this is how we give so that you can know Jesus better. What an awesome gift they gave me that day. Didn't have a thing to do with the candies. Incidentally, if I'd have had any sense at all, I'd have saved some of those candies so I could show them to you, but they're all gone by now. Trust me on that. We have a lot of different types of diversity. We often tend to think that racial and ethnic diversity is the main thing. Those two women beside me, gender diversity maybe would be the thing. Or maybe age and generational diversity. I was much younger than either of those women. But no, what we had was a psychographic diversity, a diversity in which they wanted to give to whomever they were near. The difference of life experiences is another type of diversity. All of these types of diversity run through our lives. We're not going to take the time in this service to look at each of those, but I want you to be aware that diversity is about 1,000 things. So when did we learn about diversity? I learned about diversity this last week. Actually, it was a week ago Friday, the Beltsville Adventist School had a Pastor Appreciation Day. They got all the pastors to come together who have a connection to the school. So not just the four of us here at Beltsville, but lots of other pastors as well were here. And then they gave us cards. They made cards. None of this, go to the store and buy some stuff. No, express what you mean. And there's two expressions here I want to share with you that tells me about diversity. This one says, we are all roses in a garden of thorns. The elegance of that statement just blew me away. You're not supposed to have that kind of thought about life at grade 4. But I was blown away by that. Then comes the simplicity of this card. It says, thank you on the front. And inside it says, Dear Pastor Kermit, thank you for reading the Bible. I'm thinking, how does somebody in grade school know that the job of a pastor is to read the Bible, be a person of God? Wow. Diversity. 2 children, very diverse messages, both of them blessing my life immensely. Speaking of the Bible, we've been almost Bible-free so far today. Let's stop that. Let's grab a Bible. We're going to look at this quickly. We're past quitting time, but we can't not look at the Scripture during a sermon. Acts 8 through 15, and it starts on page 776 if you're looking at a Bible there. If you brought your own, you're on your own to find Acts 8. But we're going to start with Acts chapter 8 and look at diversity in the early Christian church. Acts chapter 7 tells us the story of Stephen being stoned. And the first verse of chapter 8 picks up. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church of Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. The diversity happens. See, when all of you live in the same spot and do everything together and never make any contact with anyone outside the group, it's easy to start thinking all alike, and there's no diversity. But now God works so that people get spread out to different places. And then I want you to jump ahead to verse 36 of Acts chapter 8. Now an angel of the Lord said to Philip, go south to the road, that desert road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. So he started out, and on his way he met an Ethiopian. We're not just getting out to Judea and Samaria. We're getting out to Africa. We're going to a whole new continent. And I think you may remember that story with the Ethiopian. Philip and the Ethiopian study the Bible for a while. And the Ethiopian, down in verse 36, as they traveled along, they came to some water. And the Ethiopian said, look, here's water. Why shouldn't I be baptized? And we have a believer on a whole new continent with enriching diversity coming to the church. Now in chapter 9, we usually notice Saul's conversion story, the Damascus Road story we call it. But I want you to jump ahead to verse 32, because as the believers are getting out to Samaria and Judea and going new places, they need somebody to come visit them. And in verse 32, as Peter traveled about the country, he went to visit the saints in Lydda. And then verse 36, in Joppa there was a disciple named Tabitha, which when translated is Dorcas. And he gets to Joppa, modern day Tel Aviv, incidentally. And then he's staying in Joppa for a little while. And he's up on the rooftop. And we get to the scripture focus text for today. He's on the rooftop, he's hungry, and he has a dream. And isn't it amazing? He dreams about food. No, there's a vision that comes to him. And it's a sheet let down. And there's all kinds of animals in it. Animals that good Jewish Peter would know are unclean, not fit for food. And this voice comes from heaven that says, Peter, you're hungry. Eat already. And Peter looks at what's there and he says, I would never eat anything unclean. And the voice from heaven says, how can you call something I made unclean? And Peter's response, not recorded in Scripture, I'm sure is, because you said so in the law and the prophets. But there's this nagging doubt. God's teaching me something about clean and unclean. What am I supposed to learn here? And then, literally at just that moment, there's a knock on the door. People are coming from Cornelius. Now, Cornelius is not just a Gentile. He is a Roman, hated Gentile. He's a Roman centurion. He and his army are the people who make you obey and who make sure you hate them. And they knock at the door. And there's a really significant verse just hiding down here in chapter 10, verse 23. It's just hiding down there. Then Peter invited the men into the house to be his guests. So that was against Jewish law. You didn't invite a Gentile into your house. You didn't interact with a Gentile any more than you absolutely had to. Peter now is making himself unclean by having a Gentile under the roof. He also is making his host unclean. He goes with the people over to Cornelius' place in Caesarea. And in verse 27 and 28, Peter's talking with Cornelius. Peter goes inside, finds a large gathering of people. Verse 28, he said to them, you are well aware that it is against our law for a Jew to associate with a Gentile or visit him. But God has showed me that I should not call any man impure or unclean. Now, Peter himself is telling us that sheet with all the animals in it wasn't about food. It was about people. And Peter stays with Cornelius. They do some Bible study. Peter talks with Cornelius about things. And Peter realizes it's time for a baptism of a Gentile. Wow. But when God makes it clear, Peter obeys it. And so Peter baptizes the Gentile. Then look what happens. You see, the baptism occurs at the end of chapter 10. Chapter 11, verse 2. So when Peter went up to Jerusalem, the circumcised believers criticized him and said, "You went into the house of an uncircumcised man and ate with them." Oh, yeah. You see, breaking down some barriers leads to some criticism. But notice Peter tells the story so they learn what truly happens. And down in verse 18, when they heard this, they had no further objections and praised God, saying, "So then God has granted even the Gentiles repentance." Now, the next few chapters, Paul and Barnabas head out. They go around Asia Minor. They go all over the place that the gospel had never gone before. And they baptize a lot of people, and everything is wonderful. They come back to Antioch, the church that had sent them out, give them a report, and then some folks from Jerusalem, from this place where they don't get out much, from this place where they hang around in the cocoon and deal only with each other. Look at this, chapter 15, verse 1. Some men came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the brothers, "Unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved." Paul had been teaching just the opposite. And Paul ends up going to Jerusalem, maybe even summoned to Jerusalem. And we're going to spend just a couple more minutes here. I'm sorry for making this run long, but folks, you got to see this because it's important for us to understand about ourselves. They go to Jerusalem. They tell what all has happened. Everything is, we understand now. So let's do this. Look at verse 19 of chapter 15. James, the president of the Christian church at that time, James says, "It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God." But then look at verse 21. "For Moses has been preached in every city from the earliest times and is read in the synagogues on every Sabbath." You're Christians. You're Gentiles. You don't have to keep all the Jewish ceremonial things. And you go to the synagogue to worship. Please keep doing that. Diversity only stretches so far. We're not going to take time to look at Galatians 2. I'll just give you a quick summary. This is Paul telling about when Peter comes to Antioch. And all the believers in Antioch are eating together. Gentiles, Jews, new converts, people who've been there forever. Everybody's eating together. It's a sign of great respect for each other. Peter shows up. He's eating with everybody, no problems. A couple of the guys from Jerusalem, from the cocoon, from the little spot where everybody talks to everybody else and nobody outside of their group, they show up and they say, "We only eat with circumcised because it would be wrong to eat with people who do not keep all the Jewish laws." And Peter starts behaving like they do. The guy who was in Caesarea with Cornelius, the guy who first tore down the wall of separation, goes back to the old ways. It had only been 15 or maybe 20 years since Jesus died at that point. We've got 150 years of history. And we're still asking ourselves the question, when did we learn about diversity? When did we learn to think of each person as an individual, not as some type, some group? No, all one. And the answer to this question may not be quite as neat and tidy, as the answer to the questions that we've asked in previous weeks. In fact, we may have the question wrong. We perhaps should be asking, when will we learn about diversity? Not just to say, wow, he's a little different, bless his heart. But to say instead, she's a little different. Thank you for helping me see Jesus in a new way. This church treasures so many people in so many ways. We have a light to send out to many people about many things. But I know there will be parts of our lives that are blind to ways we don't genuinely share Jesus' love with each other as individuals. And so our question maybe should be, when will we learn about diversity? And I've asked John to come up and not have a benediction, but have a closing prayer, asking that God would bless us to that end.